Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Jason Fung. I'm thrilled to invite you to the Fasting and Longevity Summit 2.0 that I'm co-hosting with Dr. David Jockers and Dr. Joseph Antoon with over 40 top experts to share their best insights and strategies. This next video is an example of some of the great interviews that we did together for this event. This is a life-changing opportunity to discover more about this ancient transformative practice that can really boost your health and even slow down aging. The event is completely free, but you do have to register to get full access. So click on the link and join me, and let's take charge of our health together.
I just want to introduce our viewers to Gary Taubes. In case you don't know him, he's sort of the OG. He's like one of the guys in the space everybody knows and everybody really respects because you've been probably one of the most influential voices in nutrition, which is interesting because that wasn't your original background, in fact, but you came to it sort of happenstance. And in your sort of groundbreaking book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, really laid into some of the myths of nutrition and some of the really things that were just sort of, I don't know, I guess a lot of the stuff had never been looked at critically and really sort of laid it to bear. And so that's one of the reasons everybody really respects you and really been trying, you've been in this space for a bit now and really, has been a champion of good science, which I really appreciate you. So thanks for being here. I guess let's start off with your background, how you got into the space, what made you interested. I mean, I think that's a great story, a great backstory to start with.
Okay, so yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm not a physician. I don't have a PhD. I'm not a nutritionist. I have a hard science background, physics and engineering. And then when I went into journalism, I sort of stumbled into studying bad science. Technical term might be pathological science, which is the science of things that aren't so. And my first book was about high-energy physicists who discovered, much to their chagrin, non-existent elementary particles, and I documented how they came to learn they were wrong. My second book was about the sort of great scientific fiasco of the second half of the 20th century called cold fusion. Cold fusion now shows up in every other science fiction movie as the discovery, the fuel that will change society. In doing these books, I was mentored by some exquisite experimental scientists in sort of what's necessary to get the right answer in science, how critical you have to be, how skeptical you have to be, how cautious you have to be, because the possibility that you've screwed up and overinterpreted your evidence is just much greater than the possibility that you happen to get something right and do something worth paying attention to. And when I finished my cold fusion book, I had a lot of fans in the physics community, and some of them said to me, that book was called Bad Science, and it came out in 1991. And some of my physicist friends said, if you're interested in bad science, you should look at the stuff in public health. It's terrible. And I did, and they were right. That's the short form. Everything I had learned from these really hard-nosed scientists working in hard sciences, and hard sciences are sciences where you can actually test your hypotheses rigorously. Everything that I had learned about what you had to do to make sure you got the right answer was considered kind of a luxury in public health, because for the most part, we can't do it. If you have a hypothesis that some aspect of your diet or environment causes a chronic disease, you can't really test that hypothesis in an experiment. You can't randomize people to, for instance, smoke cigarettes or not smoke cigarettes and run it out for 20 years and see if the people who smoke get more lung cancer. So instead of doing these experiments, I mean, you can do them. They're always possible, but they're either unethical or exorbitantly expensive. They could take decades to do. And it's very easy to screw up an experiment. So if you take a decade doing an experiment, you don't actually know if you got the right answer or not. So then you have to spend another decade replicating it. And you have to get the funding to do all that. And so you have to convince the people in the government that they should spend tens of millions of dollars funding a trial that may or may not get the right answer. And when you're done with that, they're going to have to fund the same amount of money again to do the study over or to improve upon it to increase the likelihood that you got the right answer. So instead, we ended up with these fields, public health and nutrition and chronic disease, where for the most part, our hypotheses are never really rigorously tested, and people believe them in part because their colleagues believe them, and their colleagues believe them because they believe them. And you end up with dogmas that may or may not be correct. And in the late 90s, I was working then doing most of my work for the journal Science as an investigative reporter, and I launched into first an investigation of this conventional thinking that high blood pressure is caused by excessive salt consumption. And this evidence to support that turned out to be sort of woefully inadequate to do the kind of public health interventions we were doing. And it turned out that the researcher who had been most prominent in promoting this low salt diet dogma was one of the worst scientists I had ever interviewed. And he also took credit for getting the world on the low-fat diet we were all eating in the 90s. And when he did that, I literally hung up the phone and called my editor at Science and said, "When I'm done writing about salt, I'm going to write about fat." I have no idea what the story is, but if this guy was involved in any substantive way, I can guarantee there's a story there that we don't know about. And the low-fat dietary dogma that we all grew up believing, that a healthy diet is a low-fat diet, also turned out to be built on, sort of inadequate scientific evidence. A lot of people seeing what they wanted to see in the studies and ignoring whatever they didn't want to see, which happened in that part, that situation to be the great bulk of the evidence. And then that led me into my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And it turned out while I was sort of in doing these investigations and learning how bad the science was about these what I think are incorrect theories, dogma, that there was a very obvious alternative hypothesis that had always been mostly ignored or swept under the rug because it challenged the conventional thinking. And that was this idea that refined processed carbohydrates and sugars are the primary cause of the sort of chronic diseases that are so common in our lives now. So obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and then you could even get to stroke, cancers, Alzheimer's. The further you go out on that spectrum, the harder it gets to, the more you're speculating. But I ended up writing my book, so that on one hand, kind of explaining why what we had grown up believing was almost assuredly wrong, and then supplanting that belief system with something I believed to be right, which is where I stepped over the line from being a journalist to an amateur scientist, and probably pissed off people more than I
What
should
I
have.
what I think is interesting is your hard science background, because the thing about calories is, so I went to medical school in the 90s. So I grew up in the thick of the low fat era, all fat was bad. I learned that through medical school. Super interesting, because when it came to weight and calories, what you always hear about is, oh, it's like the first law of thermodynamics. And I'm always like, God, like the hard scientists think that's all crap. And yet the nutritionists and the, people trying to say it's all calories are equal and all this sort of stuff are always like trying to point to hard science. I called it physics envy, because they want
Yeah.
to try and pretend they've got this sort of soft science with very poor evidence, and yet they're trying to link it to physics, which is, much more definitive. in that way, especially this whole idea of cutting calories and fat being bad for you. And I find it interesting that the nutritionists think that they're hard science, the hard scientists think that they're just really really poor, like it's just not science at all, sort of thing, right? It's
Well,
just a lot of opinion.
I mean, this idea that we get fat because we eat too much seems so intuitively obvious that, I mean, we all spent decades of our life believing it. It just seemed natural. Even
Yeah.
didn't matter. Like, I often look back, I was in the junior high school in the 60s. I'm old enough. And there was two kids with obesity in my junior high school class. I knew it because we all did heavyweight wrestling, and there was three of us who were sort of big kids and two who were 40 pounds heavier. We never thought of them as kids who ate too much or kids who were lazy. You just thought of them as kids who were different. And you didn't, it's not, I can bet we didn't treat them with the respect they deserved, as everyone does, but still, we never thought of them as suffering from gluttony and sloth. But this became the sort of common way that the medical community thought about this disorder. And I know I've spoken to very good physicists. I've tried to enlist in my cause, and I can't get them to understand that it's not necessarily about eating too much, and it may not be about eating too much for anyone, that there are people who are predisposed to get heavy, and they're going to get heavier even if they restrict their diets their whole life. And there are people who are predisposed to stay lean, and they're going to stay lean even if they eat a lot. I have a sibling like that. No matter how much he ate, he was like lean and buff, and I would get thick and he would stay thin. What happened, when we talk about good science, one of the founding principles of good science, right, is you can never fall in love with your hypothesis. So the way to avoid falling in love with your hypothesis, your belief, because once you fall in love, you're going to just, and it very much relates to romantic attachments as well. You're only going to see the good things about the person you're in love with. And so you come home and you tell your mother, I'm going to marry this wonderful woman. And then your mother looks at her and sees somebody who's completely inappropriate for you, and all you see are, she's got beautiful hair, and look at this figure, and she can hold an intelligent conversation with me. And like 3 years later, you're thinking, I should have listened to my mother, or she's thinking she should have listened to her mother. But we see what we want to see once we're enamored with someone or some idea. And the way you get around that in science is you make sure you have alternative hypotheses. So many different ways you can interpret the data. And if you can think of all those many different ways yourself, you'll be equally enamored with different variations, and you won't selectively see only that which sort of feeds your love. And in nutrition and obesity, they just never did this. They got this idea and based on the laws of thermodynamics, and they thought it was physics. They did have physics envy. This is like 100 years ago. That this determined why people got fat. They would never say it determined why people got tall, even if somebody tall was very heavy, or why children grow, or any of these other growth phenomena, but that became their belief system. And it's still, nowadays, people spend a lot of time trying to blame obesity on something other than behavior. So it's like ultra-processed food. Right? And why is ultra-processed food bad for you? Because if you blame it on ultra-processed food, you can blame it on the food industry. But the reason it's bad for you is, in theory, because we eat too much of it. And the reason we eat too much of it is because it tastes too good. And then if you ask the question, why do some people eat too much and other people clearly don't because they're lean? Now you're back to blaming behavior. And so one of the issues that I've brought up in my books is that we've gotten ourselves into this fix with obesity and diabetes, not because people just doing the research just didn't think very hard about what they were doing. They never question their assumptions. They never said to themselves something simple like, why is it I'm thin and this person's, like my aunt, Elma, is not? Because I've seen her eat. She doesn't eat a lot of food, and yet she's rotund and I'm lean. So how can I blame her obesity on eating too much if she eats less than I do?
Yeah, I think that the whole idea, it comes from this sort of calories in, calories out sort of idea, which is that, hey, calories in is what you eat, and calories out is exercise. So therefore, that's all under conscious control. So
Right.
therefore, if you gain weight, it's your fault. Therefore, we can make fun of you, we can shame you because it's, it's that person's fault, which I actually think is super, super unfair. So, in terms of the sort of, you point out the sort of prevailing hypothesis, which is, you know, calories in, it's just eating too much, it's all too much, it's all about calories and so on. Uh, you know, Maybe you can lay out your alternative hypothesis for this, because I think it's very interesting. Because, when we're talking about longevity, you want to talk about preventing chronic disease, as you said, and maintaining a proper weight is obviously a very good part of that. Diabetes is another part about it, and we'll go into that later. But how would you explain, sort of in a nutshell, your alternative hypothesis, which, by the way, I and a lot of other doctors think is much more correct than the prevailing hypothesis, which unfortunately refuses to die. It's always there. We're always arguing about
Yeah.
this hypothesis. So
Okay. So, and this, let me link it into longevity, because one way to think about longevity is as the prevention of these the delaying of these chronic diseases that tend to kill us, as long as it's humanly possible. So if you can delay the onset of obesity and diabetes and heart disease and cancer and dementia and stroke, and the longer you delay it, the longer your first of all, the longer your health span is. So the longer you're healthy, the better you feel, the younger you feel, because you've delayed these chronic diseases. And then ideally you compress the chronic, at some point your body can't do it anymore. And it manifests itself in some series of pathological phenomena that will kill you. And they're very likely to be similar to these diseases. So the question of longevity is also the question of preventing and delaying these major chronic diseases. And when I talked about this alternative hypothesis being sugar refined grain hypothesis that appeared in my research, and it's very obvious when you look back at this. Basically, there was a whole group of physician researchers, mostly British, because the British had this colonial empire around the world, the British Empire. So they had physicians working all around the world and in government hospitals and missionary hospitals, and they would notice that populations that ate their traditional diets, whatever their traditional diets were. So it could be, mostly grain and mostly carbs in Southeast Asia. It could be mostly, meat and fish and sea mammals in the Arctic regions. It could be cattle and the pastoral populations and buffalo, and then elk and the Native American populations. Whatever it was they were eating, they didn't seem to get these common chronic diseases until they went through what's called a nutrition transition. So they start interacting with the West, with the Europeans and the European descendants, and we start trading them sugar and flour. And when that happens, you start seeing these epidemics of obesity and diabetes. And as this science was being written about in the medical journals, it was fairly prominent. Researchers studying heart disease, studying obesity, and then diabetes, of course, were identifying high blood sugar and elevated levels of the hormone insulin as possible causal factors in driving high blood pressure. And this whole science of metabolic syndrome, which begins to sort of appear in the medical literature in the late 50s and 1960s, courtesy mostly of a Stanford endocrinologist named Gerald Reaven, and then begins to be accepted only the 1980s to 1990s, implicates this whole slew of sort of pre-diabetes, obesity-related risk factors in heart disease. And it's always linked to the sort of carbohydrate content of the diet and the flour. So it connects completely with this idea of a nutrition transition, these other populations. So the end result is that effectively the quality of the carbohydrates you eat, so their processing and the sugar content, drive insulin resistance, for lack of a better term, which is what type 2 diabetes ultimately is severe insulin resistance. They drive obesity, and elevated blood sugar, elevated insulin levels are the most likely cause of atherosclerosis, coronary heart disease. You could link them to stroke, you could link it to cancer, you could link it to Alzheimer's. So basically, it's a picture that emerged in all these different fields. In obesity and body weight per se, the idea is that, we don't get fat because of what we eat. We get fat because what our body does with what we eat. This is a line for which I have to give Eric Westman credit. What our body does with what we eat is a process called intermediary metabolism, and it's dominated by the central nervous system and the endocrine system, hormonal glands. And the dominant gland driving fat storage is the pancreas, insulin, in effect, the dominant hormone. So once again, you've got basically, you raise insulin levels, your body preferentially stores calories as fat, and the insulin inhibits the release of fat from the fat cells. So if you're insulin resistant, you're storing fat, not burning it, in effect, and everything ties together very neatly. It doesn't mean it's right, but
I think
you
it fits
remove
the facts better than the whole calories thing.
well,
That's for sure.
I mean, the calories thing, and we could get into it in however depth you want, explains nothing. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the simplest way. The value of a theory and is what it can explain.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
explicatory power, and the idea that you get fat because you eat too much has in effect zero explanatory power, not explicatory,
Yeah.
explanatory.
But even the, if you say that all calories are equal, which you get, this is the sort of dominant sort of theory, even now. I find it very strange because the body runs on hormones, right? That's how, like, everything in our body is run by hormones,
Pretty much.
pretty much. And certain foods stimulate certain hormones. Okay, that's not controversial in any way. Some foods will stimulate insulin, and some foods won't stimulate insulin. And again, that's not controversial. That's
No.
just fact. It's accepted fact at this point because you can measure these things. So it's like, so if you eat 100 calories of a certain food, which stimulates a lot of insulin, say white bread, or you eat an egg, which stimulates 100 calories, same calories, which stimulates zero insulin.
Well,
Yet somehow we have to believe that the super high insulin versus no insulin, same 100 calories, makes no difference to the human body. No, it's like, why wouldn't it make a difference? Like, it's
this
simply
is,
nonsensical.
and this is the problem with people growing up with a belief system, because you could sit down, and I've done this, you sit down with these very esteemed, respected researchers, or they're professors at their institutions, they're head of committees, they serve on consulting boards, they work with the American Heart Association, they write journal articles and commentaries, they host conferences, and you sit down and make the argument that you just made, and I've made this with them. I mean, it doesn't matter about, we're not talking about energy here, we're just talking about the effect on the human body or any organism, and the macronutrient content of the food has, whether it's a carbohydrate or a protein or a fat, will have a very different effect on the endocrine response of that food. And the endocrine response has a very, the fat tissue and the non-fat tissue, the liver and the organs and the muscles that are burning the fuel respond to the endocrine response differently, depending on which hormones are secreted and how much. And so you've got different macronutrients, different endocrine response, different fat storage or fuel oxidation or mobilization of fuel or use of fuel or even choice of fuel, whether you're going to burn glucose or glycogen or whether you're going to burn fat or, ideally not protein. And they'll look at you like, it used to take me seriously. I'd like to think they still do. But the problem is what you're saying to them is they have been wrong about the most profound concept in their field for their entire career. And everybody they know, all the people they respect who think like they do are also wrong. And, Jason Fung, an nephrologist in Toronto, or Gary Taubes, a journalist of all things, is explaining to them why they're wrong. And nobody, it's like I've compared this, it's imagine, you're an atheist going in to speak to the Pope and you're going to explain to him why God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Or the Pope going to, you're a devout Catholic going to Richard Dawkins or one of these very famous atheists, explaining to them why God does exist. And we're not built to accept this possibility. None of us can do it.
Yeah, and the strange part, I think, is that if you just follow the logic, it's so logical that insulin is not an evil hormone, because I get this all the time, right? Oh, you're saying insulin's evil. I'm like, no, I'm not saying insulin's evil. Insulin is like a normal hormone. But to tell your body to store fat and to block fat burning, which is lipolysis, that's its job, right? And again, that's not controversial. That's its job. I'm just saying that some foods stimulate a lot of insulin, therefore it will encourage you to store that energy as opposed to leaving it for you to use, which is, to me is not controversial in any way. And yet they can't see past. And I totally agree with you. That's where that belief system, it just sort of trumps everything. And in the end, it's always hard to sort of discuss, but even harder, I think, is that they look at the studies and then everything gets interpreted in that way that, oh, there, it is all about calories. I'm like,
well, this is, you can show. So one of the reasons we believe we're right is you can tell people, so the simplest view of what's often called the carbohydrate insulin model is carbohydrates stimulate insulin secretion. The sugar has an effect that's different than grains or starches, but that effect is, end result is to increase insulin secretion. And insulin stimulates fat storage, inhibits the release of fat. So you eat carbs, you get fatter. You don't eat carbs, you get leaner. So we now have, there's 200 years of history of very influential commentators, physicians, writers saying, look, carbohydrates make people fat. That's the simplest way to think about it. They'll make everyone fat, clearly not, but those of us who get fat because of the carb content of the diet. And if we don't eat those foods, we get leaner. And now we have 25 years of clinical trials confirming that. So we have a test. But the problem is often when people get leaner, they also eat less. That's because they're burning their own fat also. So when your weight's stable, you're not burning more fat than you're storing because it's staying stable. But if you're losing weight, you're burning that fat. That's where it's going. So you don't have to eat as much, so you're not as hungry. And so you eat less. And now people say, aha, look, we did the clinical trial. These people didn't eat as much. Therefore, they lost weight because they ate less. So there's always a way to interpret the evidence.
Yeah.
Not always. The key to doing good science is to creating an experiment where there is not an alternative way to interpret the evidence, depending what you see. But there's always a way around it so they can keep their belief system intact. And they don't ever have to confront the possibility that they made a mistake of this magnitude.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think it's because there is a confounding between calories and insulin effect, because if you keep the food stable, the more you eat, the more the insulin effect. So then people say, well, it's the calories, whereas other people will say, well, it's the insulin. But
It could also be the
it's
calories include carbohydrate
yeah,
calories.
yeah.
So, if you,
There's
let's say you starve someone, this is always the observation. When I was doing my research for good calories, bad calories, people say, we know it's all about calories because when we starve people, they get thin, leaner. And I would say, yeah, but when you starve thin people, they also get thinner.
yeah.
So you don't say they're thin because they eat too much, but you're willing to say they're fat because they eat too much, because the people with obesity also get thinner when you starve them. But the point is, if somebody's eating 2,500 calories a day, or let's say 3,000, that's a lot now. It wasn't a lot 60 years ago. And 50% of that is carbs. That means they're eating 1,500 calories a day. So now you starve them and you give them, say, 600 calories. That's a classic very low calorie diet. And they're getting 300 calories from protein or 200 calories from protein, and the rest is, even if the rest is all carbs, you've cut their carb content from 1,500 calories to 400 calories a day. So maybe that's why you're seeing what you're seeing. And again, a good scientist says, oh, that's an interesting point. What experiment can I do to examine that hypothesis and see if it's valid? And you can plan experiments that do that. But in order to do that, you have to legitimately be curious. You have to be legitimately accepting the possibility that your belief system is wrong, so that you can devote energy and ingenuity and effort into figuring out which is right. And that all comes back to having to accept the possibility that you screwed up. And it's
Yeah,
hard for
that's
people to do that. I
it's
mean,
almost impossible. I
and
mean,
again, I get accused of the same thing, and then I say, well, you're right. If I'm wrong, I'm never gonna. There is no evidence that will convince me.
yeah,
And then they say, aha, Taubes is so close-minded that we can't trust anything. And I said, I'm not being close-minded. I'm being honest.
yeah,
I'm accepting that I'm just like everyone else. We're all
yeah.
like this. The
Oh, for
history of
sure.
science. So,
The history of science, for sure.
uh,
I mean, I think that that's what to me is very interesting in your book. And I think this was quite sort of eye-opening to a lot of us who read it, at least a lot of our physicians, because I've spoken to a lot of the physicians in the low carb sort of space, is that there was a lot of history of this being a well sort of accepted, that carbohydrates, they didn't know about insulin, of course, in the
right.
20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. That wasn't, they didn't know about it. But they knew, and not just physicians, but almost everybody knew that sort of some foods make you fatter and some foods don't make you fatter. So some foods are more inherently fattening than others.
Right.
And those foods tend to be sugars and refined starches. And that was sort of accepted wisdom. And that part was very interesting to me because one, I think, if you ever ask like your grandmother, they'll tell you exactly that, right? They'll be like, nobody gets fat eating broccoli, right? It's like, but eat cookies, yes, you're going to get fat. So stop eating cookies if you want to get lean. Yet there was actually a huge history, and not elsewhere, but in North America, it was sort of well accepted for so long. And then it sort of all changed in the sort of 70s, 80s. So a lot of us just don't remember any
Well,
of
this
that.
is,
So we think,
at,
you
at
know,
exactly the time that that obesity started becoming such a
yeah,
noticeable problem that diet books were becoming bestsellers regularly. And clinicians would experiment on themselves, right? So they'd get this idea. There were some research articles through the 40s, a guy named Pennington, who worked for the industrial medical division at DuPont, and he had done experiments putting executives on low-carb diets. And then people like Robert Atkins and Herman Thaler, who wrote a famous book called Calories Don't Count. And so they tried it on themselves and it worked, and you try it on your patients. It's this conversion experience that we've all gone through. People say, well, you only wrote this because it worked for you. And I said, well, that's not actually true. But if it didn't work for me, I would have been a much harder sell. The science wouldn't have
yeah,
meant so much to me when I tried carbohydrate restriction, I got fatter, for instance. And there are people out there who swear this has happened to them, and I'm willing to believe them because I think we should believe everyone until remarkable evidence demonstrates otherwise. But it's you see the same thing happen, and virtually everyone. And again, it's hard to judge without really well done clinical trials what proportion of people benefit. I mean, in your patients, you give these foods up, you get healthier. But this was happening in the 1960s. Again, there are other dogmas that entered into this field, and one of them, beginning in the 1960s, was this idea that dietary fat causes heart disease, and particularly saturated fat. And so now you have obesity doctors and cardiologists like Atkins saying, look, if you want to get lean, don't eat carbs, just eat, meat. And he said, cheeseburgers, double cheeseburgers, lobster Newburg, don't worry about the fat content, just stay away from the carbs. And this outraged the rest of the medical community because they were beginning to promote this idea that it was a dietary fat that caused heart disease. And it's a reason people like me never experimented with Atkins, because who cares if you lose weight if you have a heart attack, right? It's a trade-off isn't really worth it. So this saturated fat causes heart disease dogma became conventional wisdom. It was tested in multiple clinical trials. It never panned out in the trials,
And yet people believed it anyway, right?
But people, well, again, it's the sociology and politics are fascinating. So researchers go to the Congress in the United States and they say, we want to test this hypothesis. And Congress says, okay, we're going to give you $50 million to do the test. It's only seen as a success if the test turns out to, if the hypothesis can be confirmed. So if you do the test and then you say well, it turns out we were wrong, which in any other science is a massive victory. You've refuted your hypothesis. That's what you have to do. You have to get rid of all the wrong stuff, and then you're eventually only left with some ideas, a few of them that might be right, and then you slowly do those experiments and you whittle it down until there's only one theory left that you can trust. But in this world, if you came up with what was seen as the wrong answer, which is your hypothesis was incorrect, you not only failed the medical community and the public, you failed the congressmen who had been so kind as to allot you this money to do the study. So there was an extraordinary amount of pressure, both the researchers who wanted to prove they were right, but who wanted to justify the investment. And again, despite that, study after study failed to confirm it. But we pushed it anyway. The public health people, the U.S. The agricultural department, the USDA, you're pushing this idea that we should all eat a low-fat diet. It was probably not just a coincidence that most of the processed foods in America are high carb. So, you're pushing agriculture, you're pushing grains and sugars as much as livestock. We end up with an untenable sort of conflict between what you have to do to lose weight and what you supposedly have to do to prevent heart disease. And if we're talking longevity and doing this conversation 30 years ago, you're telling people to avoid fat and avoid salt and avoid saturated fat specifically. And now 30 years later, we're saying, don't eat sugar, refined grains, and seed oils, depending on the strength of your belief system there.
The whole salt thing hasn't really, there's not been a lot of evidence for that either.
Well, that's what got me into this.
It's less press, but it's still also one of those things that got pushed and still out there. I mean, it's but again, as a nephrologist, I get this all the time. And this whole idea that eating a low salt diet is good for you. There's no evidence really to suggest that that's true.
There's even evidence to suggest it's quite the opposite.
Quite harmful,
But this was just it was the nature of the science. The whole idea of establishing dietary causes of chronic disease is basically a post-World War II conception.
Yeah.
And this idea of, of using epidemiological studies, observational studies, these huge cohorts of 100,000 people to see what they eat and who's healthy and who's not is a post-World War II phenomenon. It's brand new sciences. And the
Yeah.
people doing this, they weren't trained as like physicists or engineers. They didn't have, they were, they were nutritionists and dietitians, and they had no real conception of what real science is, and they were making up the rules of these sciences as they went along.
So let's
So
talk about diabetes, because you wrote another book, your most recent book, Rethinking Diabetes, which was again a very insightful sort of huge amounts of information that I hadn't known before about diabetes, because that too is linked to obesity, obviously. So weight loss, diabetes, they're linked and both have a huge impact on health, mostly cardiovascular disease and cancer. But how does that sort of bad science play out in the field of diabetes?
well, again, that's another long story. I mean, the book was revelatory doing the research, by the way. I wrote that book just because I thought diabetes is it's kind of a crucial disease in this discussion, because, okay, you could argue with obesity, it's not the carbohydrates, it's the calories. A calorie is a calorie is a calorie, but diabetes is a disorder of insulin dysregulation. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. Type 1 diabetes is insulin deficiency. The insulin is responding to the carbohydrates on a fundamental level. I mean, the glucose in the circulation stimulates the pancreatic beta cells to secrete insulin. So we can put aside this whole calorie is a calorie thing because it's not relevant. And we can just ask for patients with diabetes, what's the proper way to control this disorder, and how do we prevent, in the past 60 years, the prevalence of diabetes in the United States has increased sevenfold. I mean, imagine any other disease increasing 7x in 60 years, and there'd be this public outcry. And here, there's none. It's just people say, well, we have drug therapies, and the drug and device therapies are getting better and better every year, and it's linked to obesity. So these are people who just don't have the problem. They don't know how to eat in moderation. So we can't have an outcry because it's the patient's fault, right? They're eating too much or eating the wrong foods or whatever they're doing, but it's their fault. So it turns out when you look at the history, so the first sort of successful treatment of a diabetes case was in 1797 by a British physician working for the British military, who put a army colonel who with diabetes, a guy had lost a lot of weight. He was thirsty all the time. He was peeing constantly, had all these symptoms of out of control diabetes. And this British doctor decides, Rollo, that, look, the way you diagnose diabetes, you look for sugar in the urine. Or back then they had their assistants taste the urine, and if it tasted sweet, you knew they had diabetes. Ideally, you had an assistant for that job. It's interesting how many diseases were diagnosed by tasting the urine back then, but that's a digression. Anyway, he figures that the urine's sweet, that the carbohydrates are not being properly metabolized. So let me make this guy eat a diet without carbohydrates. It's basically fatty meat and rancid meat and some green vegetables, and the guy gets better. Colonel Meredith gets better. He actually lives for 12 more years. And Rollo tries it on another patient, a general who is someone gets better, but then falls off the diet, goes back home. His regular doctor says, don't worry about you eat, and he eats whatever he wants, and he dies. So Rollo writes a pamphlet explaining what he's done, and he circulates the pamphlet all throughout the United Kingdom, and he asks physicians back then, like, try it with your patients. Diabetes was so rare that a physician might see a patient once or twice in his lifetime, and let me know what happens. And few dozen physicians write back to him when he publishes, revised versions of his pamphlet with their letters saying, it works. I get people off carbs, their diabetes more or less goes into remission. And so through the 19th century, this becomes the standard of care. So diabetes is seen as a disorder of carbohydrate metabolism. And the idea is that they can't metabolize carbohydrates safely, don't eat them. But because the patients usually, whether type 1 or type 2, and they didn't differentiate back then, they would usually show up at the doctor's only after having experienced significant weight loss. You want to put weight back on them. So you want to replace the carbohydrate calories that they're not eating with something. And the one macronutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin secretion is fat. So through the 19th century, these diets became higher and higher in fat. And by 1900, doctors are saying, look, the essence of a diabetic diet is butter. And their patients, their older patients, the younger patients who have type 1 diabetes they need insulin and they're going to die without it. And they do. This diet will slow down the disease progression, but it won't stop them from passing away from pretty awful deaths. But the older patients, who we would now say have type 2 diabetes, did fine. They lived as long as anyone. And there's some variations in therapy. A Harvard doctor comes along and does what I'm getting used to Harvard doctors doing, which is pushes a bad idea and it gets accepted. And now they're starving all these patients, and you end up with these photographs of these kids who suffer from this disorder, type 1 diabetes, that makes them ravenously hungry, and then they're treated by being starved. So it's a little bit crazy. And they're emaciated. They look like the concentration camp victims from World War II. And then insulin is discovered in 1921, the hormone insulin, and it's a miracle drug. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic earlier this year that how this affects how I see the drugs like Wegovy and semaglutide, which are their obesity drugs, and also can be wonder drugs for the people who suffer with these disorders. So as soon as insulin comes in, you could give it to these kids, the emaciated kids who are days away from dying or already in diabetic comas, and revive them. And within days, they're putting weight back on. And within weeks, they're running around the wards. And within months, they've gone back home. And as long as they take their insulin, they're living apparently perfectly normal lives. And the problem is, one of the side effects of insulin is low blood sugar. It's almost impossible to figure out how to dose this drug. Everybody was different, and you can be different at different times of the day and different days of the week. And if you exercised, you needed less or more insulin than if you didn't. And if you got a cold, you needed to. I mean, this was an incredibly dangerous drug. That was a wonder drug. And it turned out that the easiest thing to do was, you wanted to prevent low blood sugar, so you told these kids to eat carbs. So these are kids who didn't eat carbs and adults who didn't eat carbs to stay alive. And now you're telling them to eat carbs to avoid the possible fatal side effect of the cure, which is insulin. And as time went on through the 20s, doctors said, look, these kids don't want to be on diets anyway. And these kids have been diagnosed with this awful disease. You don't want them to go their whole lives not getting to eat ice cream at their birthdays or cake. And so let's just give them more and more insulin and let them eat what they want. And in fact, this was known as a liberal carbohydrate diet, and it got ever more liberal. And it started with kids, and then it moved to adults. And by the late 1930s, this is sort of now the standard of care. You might tell them to carefully consume the same amount of carbs every day to make it easier to dose their insulin to the carbs, but they're also eating carbs to make the insulin doses safe.
Yeah.
And they get to eat like their family. So nobody has to go on a diet. And by the mid-1930s, it's clear that there is a new epidemic going on. And all these kids you might have been dead at age 12, you've now kept alive for 10 or 15 years, are manifesting all the classic complications of diabetes, heart disease, kidney failure, neuropathies, and nerve failure, the amputations, they're going blind. In many of these patients, it's happening very quickly. So they go from being apparently healthy to dead within 18 months. And the medical community is mystified. They assume it's because of poorly controlled blood sugar, because that seems natural. And the older patients are also manifesting these same chronic conditions. It's just happening slower with them, but they're all getting insulin. And what they don't even think about is they don't actually know what the blood sugar is doing alone, because they didn't have people staying alive without using insulin to control the blood sugar. All they know is that the combination of the insulin doses, which are very high compared to what your pancreas secretes naturally, and the high blood sugar, because you're still doing a lousy job of controlling blood sugar, might be causing these chronic conditions. And they struggled with these chronic complications. We still struggle with these complications today, 80 years later, 90 years later. The side effects of complications, consequences of living with diabetes can be awful. Most of the, as a nephrologist, the dialysis, the kidney failure, most of the amputations in America, limb amputations, are from neuropathies and poorly controlled diabetes. And along the way, they never said to themselves, they meaning the medical community at large, never said, well, wait a minute, we never tested this alternative approach. There were actually physicians writing about this in the 1920s, just don't feed these people carbs.
Yeah, and I think back then it was also confusing, because there's the type 1s and the type 2s, which are really two completely different diseases.
Right.
Yes, they both have high blood glucose, but so they're like, that's diabetes, but that's sort of like saying, oh, you have a fever. Well, it could be from, COVID. It could be from a bacterial abscess. It could be from 10,000 things, right? Lupus, whatever. And saying, oh, it's the same disease. We should all treat them the same. It's like, oh, so
well, this is
it's just so stupid sometimes.
I mean, it's when you look at the history, again, we're reporting this book. It is not, as you know, it's not a diet book. It's not any particularly easy read, but the reporting and writing was fascinating. They couldn't measure, we couldn't measure hormone levels in the blood. Okay, so the assumption was, if you have what they call an endocrine disorder, endocrine is a fancy word for a hormone, some kind of glandular disorder, we assume the problem is with the glands. So there's something wrong, and they would identify, that you had hyperthyroid conditions, too much thyroid being secreted, and you had hypothyroid, too little thyroid, but you couldn't actually measure the level of thyroid hormones. You just knew that you saw these symptoms for one and these symptoms for the other, and the hypothyroid, too little, could be treated by giving the person thyroid. So the assumption with insulin was it was all insulin deficiency, because we could treat it by giving them insulin. And there was some talk of insulin resistance, because these older, heavier patients with diabetes needed massive amounts of insulin to lower their blood sugar. But nobody really knew what that meant. And not until 1960 is there a technology, a test, an assay that allows you to measure hormone levels in the blood. So the very first paper by this team, Yalow and Burson, very first paper, they talk about insulin resistance, because patients with type 2 diabetes, or overweight older patients with diabetes, and obese patients have high levels of insulin and high levels of blood sugar. So they're not insulin deficient, they actually have too much insulin. And as you said, when talking about hormonal disorders in every other field, and I'm reading textbooks from German textbooks, which I get translate, ChatGPT will translate for me, and I'm reading them from the 1920s, and it's, you've got, like I said, hyperthyroid and hypothyroid. You've got hyperpituitary diseases and hypopituitary. They hadn't discovered growth hormone by then. You've got hypogenitalia disease. And you did too much sex hormones created this disease, too little created that disease. But if you didn't actually see the symptoms, you just assumed the symptom was high blood sugar, then nobody ever questioned, why is it one disorder? Not until the 1960s do you learn type 2 is too much insulin, type 1 is not enough, type 2 is
Yeah.
insulin resistance, type
But
1 is
what's
not.
interesting about that is that that whole idea, like you're saying, that these sort of, when you see everything through a belief system, right? So even through now, you hear this now, which is I find stunning. Type 2 diabetes, where you can measure insulin levels. You know they're too high. Everybody knows they're too high. But it
Right.
gets called in the medical literature as relative deficiency. It's like, what the hell are
Because
you
it's not doing
talking
its
about?
job, right? Because
It's
blood
not doing
sugar.
its job. So it's too low, actually,
But that
even
also,
though it's too high. Ugh,
yeah, and that justifies, right, the
that
treatment, which is
justifies the
give them
treatment.
more insulin.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think, yeah,
And
is
then
sort of.
you do clinical trials, and to the diabetes community's benefit, they actually do these trials, because in obesity research, they won't do it.
Yeah.
They know it's all about calories, so they're not going to test it. But the diabetes researchers have done clinical trial, clinical testing, their fundamental beliefs, and they've refuted almost all of them. And
Yeah.
now where they lose credit is they don't say that. I mean, one of my favorite quotes was from a guy at Harvard who in the New York Times in 2013 is quoted saying, they do this huge study because fundamental belief in diabetes is if you could reduce weight, type 2 diabetics, you will have less what are called macrovascular complications, heart disease, stroke. And huge study called Look Ahead, $200 million. Get these people to lose weight. They get them to lose weight. There's no difference in heart disease. Completely demolishes the fundamental belief system in the field that gone back 100 years. Is the professor at Harvard, very well-respected diabetologist, is quoted in the New York Times saying, we have to have an adult conversation about this. And they never do.
Yeah,
Because what do you do? Like I said, nobody wants to accept the fact that they're wrong about these things. But then when you demonstrated that you're wrong, what do you do about that? Particularly if you're a clinician, a medical doctor. If you're a scientist, you could say, well, let's do some more tests. And then you're accused of being in it for the money, because let's do some more tests means give me more funding and I'll do more
right.
studies. But what do you do with that? And what they do with it is they just kind of ignore it. They write some commentaries
Yeah.
and some opinion pieces, and they move on and go back to doing what they've always done. And if they wait long enough, you'll get a better drug, which is what's happened.
Yeah, I think that happened too. And I'm gonna have to wrap this up. But yeah, also in 2009, when the Accord, the advanced study, so this idea that
That's
everything bad was due to the high blood sugar. So
right.
therefore, do whatever you have to do, get that blood sugar down, you're gonna do better. Turns
Intensive
out,
insulin therapy. Yeah.
exactly,
Give them more
give
insulin,
them
they'll
more.
do better.
In fact, they did worse.
And they
And
did
it wasn't
worse.
one study, it was multiple studies showed this. So
3
that
studies.
I remember being, I was in practice by that time. And I think this change, I was reading these papers, I was like, this changes everything, like everything about treating diabetes, because that's a huge disease for me as a nephrologist. And what changed in the treatment of diabetes? Nothing.
Well,
They
that's
didn't
and
recommend any changes. I was like, oh my God, like what is happening here? Like,
and this is an obvious issue. It's just, look, there are 2 levers you could use to manipulate blood sugar. You could use diet or you could use drugs. 2 major levers, minor levers like exercise and sleep, but those are the major levers. And so we've demonstrated that drugs don't help. A natural question to ask is, well, what if we pull the other lever? What if we use diet to lower blood sugar? Because we know we did that for 123 years before insulin was discovered, and it seemed to work. It's just a natural question to ask. But these people, they, they also have, when you you hold an incorrect belief system and it's constantly being challenged by evidence, you develop sort of a defense immune system to defend yourself against these infectious nuggets of evidence. And so you develop all these ways to think about the problem that convince you you're still right, even as the evidence is saying you're wrong. So one of these belief systems is nobody follows a diet. So
Oh, yeah.
why would we do that? Why would we tell people to eat this way when we know they're not going to follow it? And then you could have a conversation. Well, I've had conversations where I say, how do you know people are not going to follow it? And it's because it's who wants to eat like that? And I said, well, yeah, I'm going to acknowledge to you that I do, because I find that I could sustain a 30-pound weight loss. And, I mean, I seem to be very healthy for the guy who's getting on in years, and I want to stay healthy. And they'll say, oh, you're one of those keto people. And now they can dismiss you because of it's just and again, you can't
Yeah.
blame them. The people like you actually allow the evidence to change your mind are few and far between.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately.
you need not only personal experience. Ideally, it's personal experience. A lot of the people who think like we do now do it because they said, okay, who knows? Maybe this Fung character knows what he's talking about. Let me try some intermittent fasting and then give up carbs and see what happens. And they get healthier. And then it's like, oh, well, that was interesting. Now
Yeah.
I care. Or they try it on their patients and their patients get healthier. But if you're like, if I'm talking to a lean marathon running physician, it's like, I'm never going to get through to him.
Yeah. It's like a wall, They just
Yeah.
can't break through that wall. I think and the academics are even harder because they've got this idea that they're the smartest people in that subject in the
No, and
room.
they've got all this feedback, right? They've
Yeah.
moved up in their careers,
They've
they've
got
become
accolades.
professors, they
Yeah.
got accolades. It's like, who wouldn't?
Yeah.
Um, the excuse me. Since we're running out of time, we should tie this back, right?
Yeah, so let's just I think we're just over actually, but
Well,
let's just tie this back quickly to the longevity story and then wrap it up from there.
right. So longevity, you want to prevent delay chronic diseases. That's part of it, as long as you can, if not indefinitely. This alternative hypothesis, these chronic diseases are triggered, in effect. The predisposition, it's a the genes triggered by the environment has changed. We've added sugar and refined grains. And like I said, if you believe the seed oil hypothesis, sugar, refined processed grains, seed oils, we know from now several hundred clinical trials that if you remove the carbohydrate, if you tell people don't eat the sugars and the grains and the starches, don't drink caloric beverages for the most part, which are inevitably sugar, beer, that you'll get healthier. We see that happening with people. And you can't, I mean, I don't believe I can promise these people they'll live longer. Again, that was the scary thing about the diabetes experience with type 1 and insulin is, you clearly wonder drug comes in, saves these kids' lives, and then 15 years later, all hell breaks loose. You never know, but you could make a very good argument that if you want to, the first step to maximizing your longevity is removing these foods from your diet.
I completely agree because if you think about, the two main causes of death, like by far and away in the United States, cardiovascular disease and cancer, both huge, very, very powerful links to both obesity and diabetes. Diabetes much more strongly because, of course, that's a much more serious health condition. But you see, like, there's tons of data showing that there's obesity-associated cancers, including extremely important ones, such as breast cancer, colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer. So very, very strong link between obesity and cancer, very, very strong link between diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So clearly, since those are the two sort of dominant diseases of our day, right? 100 years ago, we'd be talking about, I don't know, TB or something like that,
Yeah.
right? But of this modern era, those are the things we have to focus on. And I thank you for sort of bringing your hard science, hard-nosed approach to a lot of these fields, because it's opened a lot of people's eyes, including mine. And I think thank you so much for being here, and thanks for having such a great conversation about this. I really enjoyed it.
Again, thank you, Jason.
All right, that's good. I think we're a wrap. Thanks so much, Gary. I know we went a bit over Renee, but hopefully that's okay.
I was here in the background the entire time. And as a first row seat viewer, I can say it was incredible. And I wish you guys could have gone for another hour. It was wonderful. So thank you both for your time. Gary, I'm probably going to ping you maybe in like a month or so, just to I know you're pretty active on X, old OG Twitter, to just let people know that your interview with Dr. Fung is going to be coming out. And otherwise, you guys are all set. So phenomenal.
Terrific.
Okay. Thanks so much.
That was
All
fun.
right.
Thanks,
That was
Jason.
fun. Thank you. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Yeah.
That would be
Bye.
nice. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye, guys.